Lidica was just buffed, and while at a first glance these changes might not seem massive, this actually fixes some of the biggest issues that she's had, especially with her kit in the current game. So today we'll be going over what's changed in her kit, why it matters, and why Lidica can finally become strong again. So without further ado, let's get straight into it. Lidica previously was always kind of fixated or focused on being a control opener. She fixated or focused specifically on removing immunity, preventing opponents from countering, and enabling the rest of your team to do their work either through defense breaking, giving skill nulls, etc, etc. The problem though was, of course, that reducing buff duration by 1 turn wasn't enough, as characters like Aram were introduced, and even after Lidica was, well, able to take the turn, Aram would have a 3-turn immunity and completely block her debuffs rather from landing properly. In the current state of the game, that basically makes her much more reliable than she used to be until today, which is where we now effectively have these changes or buffs to her kit. With this, the first change is her skill 2. This one's arguably, and I would say most obviously, the biggest change. Previously, Thornbush only reduced buff durations by 1 turn before applying bind, but now this fully dispels all buffs before applying said debuff again. Now this directly fixes again the immunity counter which Aram had that previously prevented her from landing any debuffs, but to be clear, she still has the same 25% CR per target, and this is very helpful for her extra turn that she gains, which allows her to then use her skill 3, defense breaking, and providing skill nulls to the team at the same time. Now, I would also like to highlight that the current meta is definitely more suited for her. To illustrate, here's some B-roll that I'll be playing, and you can kind of see exactly what's going on when it comes to her kit. Now, one of the most important things to consider about the current game, though, is how the game revolves around evasion characters. Previously, characters like Setsuka were very annoying for Lidica to deal with due to evasion and her missing strips/debuffs while trying to hit the enemy team, but now there are other characters that have been introduced, including characters like Xeno, who do solve a lot of these problems. Xeno specifically allows Lidica to land onto meta units like Setsuka, Arby, Fire Cigarette, or basically any character that you can think of, but as a mage, she also gives access, or I should say, Xeno specifically also as a mage gives access to Tagahills, which is very valuable for a character like Lidica. So not only did Lidica herself improve, this was basically one of the other ways that she can more easily navigate through a draft, and it's also worth mentioning that she is, of course, one of the only characters who applies bind. Now, this is something that I think is quite relevant for 2 reasons, and something that I'd like to highlight or showcase with this specific clip here. Now, as you can see here, this is a quick recording, of course, of the exact same match that we went through. And apologies, of course, there isn't exactly an evasion here, but you kind of get the idea. Any of these characters here on the right side could be replaced with Setsuka or another evasion character. However, to be more specific, what's super crazy about Lidica's bind is the fact that Biblis's skill 2 here will actually go off cooldown or activate, which is, again, something that basically no other character can argue can happen or can do for a team, which is important for a few reasons. Formerly, if you're someone that has played with or played someone like Lidica in the past, or especially if you're someone that just plays against Biblis, being able to actually put this skill 2 on cooldown is extremely difficult, and something that most times you don't actually have the ability to do, and instead you try to stun or prevent Biblis from doing this by using Silverblade Araminta, using someone like Holy, etc, etc. Now, the most important thing that I'd like to point out here, though, is that, again, as Biblis is one of the most popular characters in the game, and this interaction exists only for Lidica, this is naturally one of the, I would say, nicer reasons or more appealing reasons to even take her, as otherwise you are kind of locked between some other options which are a little bit too cleave or a little bit too speed heavy, including characters like Coley, who may end up then preventing you from being able to slow down, which is not necessarily something that Lidica is as vulnerable to. Now, I'd also like to actually talk about the changes to her EE. Now, this isn't super insane or super huge, but in case you're curious, the 30 EE effect was changed, and formerly this reduced buff duration by an additional turn when using Thornbush, but now it applies speed down for 2 turns when using skill 3. Realistically, though, this doesn't really change much for Lidica players because, let's be honest, most people weren't using the skill 3 EE anyways, and with this, her skill 2 EE is still obviously, I'd say, the best and most preferred option, thanks to the value of strip, or rather of restrict and not allowing enemies to push up, and this is still true even post-buff. Now, let's actually talk about the stats here. Now, of course, yes, I get it. This is a very fast Lidica. I acknowledge, and I totally understand that when it comes to building or stat suggestions for a character, it's very difficult to tell someone to just get more speed. That aside, this is definitely going to be a character that you would put your fastest gear on with an F ring, and I do want to mention that you could of course also include something like a crit chance neck if you want to use characters like Cdom or even Commander Pavel, but the priority should definitely be effectiveness over crit rate, since not landing debuffs or not stripping is definitely game losing in 99% of cases. Now, moving on from that, I would say that in terms of obviously set, it would be nice to have speed and F if you can. If you could be speed and immunity and you're trying to play something slower, that's also technically fine, but that has to do a bit more with buff stacking, which is something that is definitely more specific in particular and not the point of my stat suggestions. However, if you were trying to race someone like Lidica, or race with someone like Lidica, just keep in mind that she does have pretty good base speed, but of course the main point here is that you are trying to of course race characters like Ran, Peyra, etc. if you're trying to play Lidica as a very, very fast option, or at the very minimum you're trying to race them with an additional imprint, including characters like the ML Shuri, the Dark Shuri that applies bombs, someone like Holy, or any other sort of speed imprint, unless of course you're just beating up on someone that's much slower. Now, artifact option-wise, we have a few here. You could, of course, use Renewed Will, which I would find to be maybe the best option in general. This is a Combat Readiness push, which is super big. This also, of course, gives attack. You could also use something like Gifted Pen, but in my opinion, Gifted Pen is arguably a bit more situational, I'd say. It's nice if you want some of the effectiveness, and it does give a single target CR push, but I'd actually want to highlight and mention that if you are especially someone that's trying to play slower, something like Guiding Light is nice to avoid Zeo if you aren't someone that wants to deal with him, especially in something like Arena or Guild War. But the reality is that for most players, you are going to be pre-banning Zeo, especially if you're trying to play a faster playstyle in RTA or in other PvP formats, and otherwise you could also use something like Elegate Candle, which I think is quite nice if you're trying to RNG or pray that you get a bunch of debuffs. I apologize, I don't know why I can't find it. But you get the point. Being able to defense break, oh, here it is. Being able to defense break and AoE, in AoE fashion, I should say, is pretty nice. But as a side note, and something that I feel like is criminally understated or overlooked, is the fact that this Elegate Candle effect does actually require you to have effectiveness on Lidica, as the Soulburn effect on Lidica's S2 does not account for or take this into consideration when applying or trying to land this Elegate Candle chance. Now, I'd also like to talk about the other characters that Lidica can work well with, and though I mentioned, of course, Xeno earlier, she definitely works best in aggressive drafts where she can eliminate slower turn 2 teams before they actually take a turn. With this, one of the best partners that she actually has access to, in my opinion, right now is the new Arbiter Vildred, but of course, depending on how you choose to play the new Arbiter Vildred, there are a lot of different variations or builds that work here. The main reason for this, though, is that, of course, Arby is one of the rare DPS currently now that doesn't really care about the damage reflect from Biblis, but another character that I think a lot of players are maybe or had maybe seen in the past show up with Lidica was actually this Spirit Eye Selene character, who is here. There it is. Now, Spirit Eye Selene is super nice for a few reasons, but if you've already seen this duo played before, the two synergize extremely well. Lidica provides Selene a buff to activate her skill 1 passive, which allows her to, of course, gain an attack increase and one-shot things, but Lidica also defense breaks using her skill 3, which is nice because then, again, with this insane S1 nuke, you can then one-shot said character. Now, for that, though, I would still say that in general, you would likely want someone like Lidica to have something like the, like a book or some sort of additional safety net so that Lidica plus Selene together can actually combine the defense break here into maybe not just 1 kill, but even 2, or even technically even 3 if you have Selene, because again, Selene's S2 allows her 1 free soul burn, or rather her S1 passive gives her 1 free soul burn. But in general, if you're trying to find a mage that pairs well with Lidica and Selene, there are a lot of different options that you could use here. I would argue that some of the most popular, though, include something like Shepherd of the Dark DN, who of course has an insane synergy with most of these characters, including being able to push up and then also have immortality and then being able to seal here. Of course, you can also pair with characters like the Silverblade Araminta, who Again, has the ability to strip, has their own combat readiness push, and is quite self-sufficient. You could, of course, use Xeno, as I mentioned earlier, for like the evasion reduction and also being able to, S3 rupture, unbuffable. But finally, and I'll be making a separate video entirely on her later, I actually want to highlight just how strong Challenger Dominielle is now. This character is actually extremely slept on and underrated, I'd say. I think a lot of players were probably interested in seeing if an ML4 could be good again, and though I haven't seen an insane amount of testing for her outside of a few specific Cleave players, I think she's actually quite strong now. And in terms of what's available, or mages in general, I definitely think Cdom is a good option for what the Lidica Cleave could look like right now. I'd actually like to take a moment, though, to highlight what this can look like for a Cleave, though. And you're probably familiar with or have seen a lot of these very AoE-heavy or very tanky teams. This team here specifically does actually end up just getting one shot from the Lidica. And, of course, I do have a couple of fast characters here, but the speed of the characters don't necessarily matter. The important thing to know in terms of speed tuning is that Briar Witch Iceria will go after Strays. Lidica will go first. She'll obviously use her soul burn. She'll activate the DN in this case, and you'll basically see a very clean one-shot. Now again, in terms of cleaving an arena, unfortunately, this is not something where you can obviously do something like a very clean auto battle. That's just the way things go, unfortunately, with these characters. But as you can see here, we already have the restrict, so even with Secret Storm or Secret Art Storm, the Yulha wasn't able to push up here. We push back, they reset a little bit. We have the ability to defense break here. If this one defense break isn't enough, that's fine, because of course we have Briar Witch Iceria here, or well, okay, you get the idea. Briar Witch Iceria was supposed to be here. She's about 285 speed to cut. Otherwise, though, of course, this isn't, I mean, even as you're seeing, super necessary. You could just use someone like Hades here if you want to just avoid or prevent the revival. But even without the Briar Witch Iceria here, we were able to one-shot the team. And this is obviously pretty strong off of the back of Lidica herself. Now, in terms of what we otherwise have access to, I would say Lidica isn't wasn't super weak to begin with. I think truly she was just missing basically the one change that she needed and that they gave her, which is the ability to strip for her to actually be strong again. I don't know for sure whether or not this is the healthiest way for her to change, as normally characters are balanced or adjusted or changed so that they can't or aren't able to just bypass a form of restriction. In this case, again, this is kind of like as if they had introduced Ilanov to Strays, or Ilanov to stop Strays, and then they read or introduced Strays basically ignoring defense pen resist, like that kind of you know what I mean? Like Lidica basically was just freed of her former shackle, which again does make her very strong, but again, I'm not entirely sure if this is the right direction, though I'm always a fan of playing Lidica, so I'm happy with what we're seeing here. That said, if you're a Cleave or Control player, I definitely think that Lidica, in terms of should you use her value, is definitely worth revisiting. If you're a Standard or Bruiser player, she's definitely still more niche, something that you could maybe, or a character that you may be able to run on something like Guiding Light as a answer, or a fast answer as a slower player, but again, is more niche and may be able to counter some other faster player. Otherwise, I think that existing Lidica owners who have this character should definitely test her again to see if you like her, especially in Arena and Guild War. But otherwise, guys, this buff definitely doesn't reinvent Lidica, but it definitely lets her function the way that she was basically stopped from doing in the past, but was always basically, I guess, supposed to punish, or basically now punishes the teams that she was always supposed to. Honestly, though, for what she's paired, or what she has access to pair-wise, especially with the newer meta options, she's for sure very strong now, and otherwise you'll probably see her much more in the near future. Thanks again for watching though, guys. I'll see you all next time. Stay safe, stay healthy. Good night.